My name is Dory Bellin. I'm from the State Water Board GAMA program. You're here today to learn about some work that the GAMA program has funded through our Special Studies project. We've worked with UC Davis, Thomas Harder, and his team. They have been developing a toolbox for Nonpoint Source assessments, and they will be going through that tool with you today. First, I'm going to have our supervisor for the GAMA program, Aaron Button. He's going to say hello. And then we'll turn it over to Thomas and his team, where he will go over introductions for who is presenting today and any of the meeting agenda and rules and move from there. So go ahead, Aaron. And thank you guys. If you have any questions during, go ahead and please put it in the chat. If it's something that we can clarify then and there, we'll go ahead and interrupt. But if it's something we can save for the Q&A session, we're going to do that too. So please feel free to enter in those questions. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Dory. I appreciate the introduction. Yeah, so my name is Aaron Button. I'm the supervisor for our GAMA program. And again, just to reiterate, I'm really thankful that everybody is having this opportunity to attend this presentation and this somewhat of training and release of this new tool. So it's been a long time coming. We've been working this for quite some time. So we've been looking forward to this. And again, thank you for being here. So with that, and Thomas, take it away.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you, Dory. Yes, big thank you to State Water Resources Control Board for all the support to develop this tool and get us to where we are now. Welcome, everybody. My name is Thomas Harder. I'm a professor and a professor of cooperative extension at the University of California, Davis, and I run the Groundwater in Agriculture program here at University of California, Davis, and the University of California Ag and Natural Resources program. It is my pleasure to have you all here this afternoon, and I wanted to give our team an opportunity to introduce themselves. Georgos, why don't you go and introduce yourself?
Hello, thanks all for being here. I'm Yorgos Kourakos, and I have been a researcher at the University of Davis almost 15 years now, and pretty much I'm working all this time for developing actually this tool in one way or another.
Yeah.
And thanks again for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Georgos. Zendan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zhen Dan. I'm a PhD student working with Professor Harder. I'm doing all the nitrate modeling in the whole Central Valley. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Zendan. Bybus.
Hi, I'm Pivas. I am working for Thomas as a postdoc. In the context of Central Valley, my role is mostly doing the nitrogen accounting part, that is what is entering the groundwater. Thanks for joining our seminar.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Really quick review on the rules for how we're holding this meeting. This is a regular Zoom meeting, so you do actually have a lot of tools at your fingertips. We trust that everybody will be familiar with protocols for these types of meetings. We ask that you turn your camera and your microphone off until we get to Q&A session. If you have questions, either whether it's clarifying questions or bigger questions, please put them in the chat. Dory will be watching the chat, and she will ping the clarifying questions to the speaker as they come along, and all of the bigger questions will hold for our Q&A session. Will be the rough schedule is that we'll have probably about an hour and a half on session one, and then have 10-minute break, and then go for another 50 minutes or so on actually going through the toolbox and giving you the training on the toolbox, and then have about a half an hour toward the end. And it can be open-ended from my end, and I think the Zoom meeting will stay on. But from 3:30 to 4 o'clock, we should have question and answer session. So with that said, let me share my screen and we'll get us rolling. I'm going to take a second here to get all of my floating meeting controls off because I just have one monitor. And I think here we go. So this is about the Central Valley Nonpoint Source Assessment Tool, and specifically about the web version of this tool today. And before I get really started talking about this tool together with Georgos, Zendan, and Bybus, I want to also give a shout out to Shreya Matthews, who's been our developer on the front-end tool for the last year. And there's been a number of other undergraduate students that have been helping us develop the front end. Where I want to start is talk about pollution. This tool is about doing a pollution assessment. And so in order to understand the tool, I really need to talk about the basic principle of pollution and give you a sort of a basic framework to work with today, and that will hopefully help you with us, kind of carry with us through this presentation, some basic concepts. The first really basic concept I want to convey here is that all pollution problems have three basic elements. They have sources, they have pathways, and they have what we call receptors. And that goes for air pollution, where you have sources of air pollution, you have a pathway through the atmosphere, and then you have people that are impacted by that pollution. We have that same thing in surface water. We have sources of surface water pollution. We have pathways for that pollution, and we have receptors that are impacted by that pollution. And in the same way, it goes with groundwater. We have sources of groundwater pollution. We have pathways for that pollution to move through the aquifer. And then we have receptors, which in the case of groundwater, when we think of receptors for the purposes of this presentation today, we really talk about wells, or to the degree that groundwater goes into streams, it could be streams. So three things that go with pollution: sources, pathways, and receptors. And we're going to try to sort of guide you with these three elements through this presentation today. The other piece that I want you to be aware of is that each of these three, sources, pathways, and receptors, are associated with flows, and they're associated with concentration of pollutants. So we have a flow of air out of the chimney, and in that flow of air, there is a concentration of pollutant. And there's a flow of air in the atmosphere with a concentration of pollutant. And then at the receptor, there is a flow of air into the receptor with a concentration of the pollutant. Similarly, in the river, we have flows and concentrations at the source, in the pathway, and how it gets to the receptor. Same in groundwater. We have a source, and there is flow associated with that source, recharge or discharge to groundwater. Concentration is associated with that. That concentration changes along the pathway, and then eventually we have a flow going into the well that's associated with some concentration. Concentration is the mass of the pollutant per unit flow volume. So it's actually about, we sometimes refer to mass, sometimes we refer to concentration. The mass per unit flow is what is concentration. So these three are all related to each other. So we have source, pathway, receptors, and each of those associated with flow and with concentration or mass. And to understand and assess a pollution problem, we need to understand everything we can about source, pathways, and receptors, and the flow and concentrations that are associated with source, pathway, and receptor. So what we do in CV-NPSAT, or where CV stands for the Central Valley, and NPSAT stands for Nonpoint Source Assessment Tool, which is a general framework that is applicable not just to the Central Valley, but to other basins as well. In this tool, we combine all of our knowledge about sources of non-point source pollution. Specifically, we're talking about nitrate today, with all of our knowledge about pathways in the unsaturated zone, below the land surface, in the water table, and pathways in the aquifer, in this case, the large alluvial aquifer of the Central Valley. And we combine that with all of our knowledge about the receptors, that is the location, the depth, and the length of the screens of wells where water flows into the well and is being pumped out. And again, this knowledge is knowledge about water flow rates and volumes at the source, at the pathways, at the receptors, and about pollutant mass and concentrations at the sources, throughout the pathways, and at the receptors. Specifically, what you can do with this toolbox, with this CV-NPSAT web toolbox that we will be demonstrating today, just to kind of get to the finish line here right away, is you will be able to select an area in the Central Valley where you can manipulate the sources of nitrate. You can basically use sliders to change specific sources in your area of interest, and then push a button. And then we have our web tool. Behind that web tool is a back engine that is an NPSAT. And you have some choices about which one of these back engines you're using to make a prediction about nitrate in wells in your area of interest. And the tool will then show you what would have happened without you intervening, without your scenario, under what we call a business as usual scenario, and what you achieved by changing your scenario, which could be more or less nitrate going into the aquifer in the future over the next 100, 200, 300 years. That's basically all this tool is. You get to play with the sources. The tool takes it along the pathways and will tell you what happens at the receptors. That is the wells in your area of interest. That's it. So that said, we're going to go over this conceptual framework here in this workshop, how this actually works, this toolbox. We will talk about some important simplifications that went into building this toolbox to make it work. We talk about how we have validated the outcomes from this toolbox. We talk about things that this toolbox cannot be used for, and what we're planning to do in the future with this toolbox. We'll take a 10-minute break at that point, and then I will walk you through the online tool. Just a heads up, and I sent that in the email to those that had registered by yesterday. You will not be able to get into the online tool today. We will open that up next week. There's a single server behind that tool, and we don't want to overwhelm that server today. And as I said, we'll have a Q&A session at the end. One of the really important things about anything that has to do with modeling is all models are wrong. There are none that are perfect, but some models are useful. And the main reason for that is that the knowledge about the things we model, in this case, this pollution problem with its sources, its pathways, and its receptors, there's a lot of information that goes into this. And some of it we know very well, especially some of the physical laws we know really well, but some of it we don't know that well. We have to guess or estimate based on best knowledge, based on data that tell us something about the source or something about the aquifer, but not directly what we need to know. We have an aquifer test that tells us about aquifer conductivity in some places, but not in other places. So we make interpolations, we make estimates. And what I'm using these two symbols for today, and Georgos in his presentation as well, is this indicates things that we know pretty well, maybe not perfectly, but pretty well. And this denotes things that we don't know so well, where we have to make some major estimates or interpolations or simplifications. So look for those symbols, and always keep in mind that there's data behind things, that some of them are better, some of them are worse, some of them, it's not so much that we got bad data, it's just that we don't have all the data we would like to have to understand this really complex problem. So the first thing we need to talk about is the source, right? Understanding the source is really important. And the source that we're talking about today is nitrate. The sources of nitrate that end up in groundwater. So for that, the part in this CV-NPSAT framework that we have developed specifically to understand the mass of nitrate nitrogen that leaches out of the landscape traveling into groundwater, We call this the Central Valley Groundwater Nitrogen Loading Model, or CV-GNLM. This groundwater nitrogen loading model, or you could also think of it as a leaching model, is about the nitrogen mass, not about concentration. It's about mass, and we get to concentration by then looking at that flow later. We'll talk about that, not just right now. So who are those sources of nitrate in groundwater in the Central Valley? This is from an update from an assessment that we did in 2017, and you'll find it if you point your camera at this QR code, and we'll have more QR codes later. You can find this. You can see that cropland is the main source of nitrogen leaching potentially out of the landscape on its way to groundwater. We have many other sources. There's wastewater leaking from pipelines in urban areas. There is golf courses. There is wastewater lagoons. There's animal corrals. We have percolation basins in wastewater treatment plants and food processors. And we have septic systems, to name some of the other big sources of nitrate nitrogen, all of which we're taking into account in this groundwater nitrogen loading model for the Central Valley. Now, where are these sources? These sources are all over our landscape. The cropland in this toolbox is divided into about 50 different crops. So the 250 crops that are grown across the Central Valley are grouped into 50 major crops, classified by the Department of Water Resources in their now annual land use survey. It used to be decadal land use surveys. So these nitrate sources are distributed all over the valley, highly heterogeneous patterns. We have areas with more tree crops. We have areas with more vineyards. We have areas where we have a lot of dairies. We have areas with rice, et cetera, et cetera. So we've mapped these out. We've mapped out urban areas. We've mapped out golf courses. We've mapped out percolation ponds, lagoons. We've mapped out the animal holding areas on the dairies in the Central Valley. We've mapped out food processors and wastewater treatment plants. And we have mapped out the population that has septic systems, so we can estimate the nitrate leaching, potential nitrate leaching coming from all of these sources. And the question is, well, that's nice that you have all this information for today, but what about the fact that we have a lot of nitrate from, another day, from long time ago? Well, why is that long time ago important? I need to sort of take a sidestep here and explain that to you. So what you're looking at here is a map of what we call the source area of a large production well. So this production well pumps about 1,100 gallons per minute. It's a typical production well in the Central Valley. One simplification that I have made in generating this particular source area is that I've made an assumption that there's not other wells that are impacting the flow to this well. So it's kind of going from the right. The flow, groundwater flow, is from the right to the left. So the right is where the mountains are, and to the left is where the river is, wherever you are in the Central Valley. And water captured by this well has been recharged in this area nearby the well up to about, we're talking about 11 miles away. So this whole area is 3 miles wide and about 10 miles long. So this source area is almost 10 miles for this particular well. And the color here, and this is the important part, indicates how long it takes to get from here to the well. So this light blue area indicates that we're at about somewhere over 200 years. The red areas were, talking about years to a few decades. All this water gets into the well, and in the well, these different ages are being mixed. So what's coming out of the well is a mix of water, some of which has been recharged nearby and might be a few years old, some of which has been recharged decades ago, maybe centuries ago, and coming into the well, and it gets mixed in here. So wells always have mixtures of water, some younger, some older, but nothing is in that well that actually happened yesterday, or in most wells, we don't even see things for at least 2 or 3 years at the earliest. What this is showing in the bottom is how uncertain we are, or how certain we are about these ages. We know that this tail end is really old, so we're pretty certain about that, relatively speaking, not to the year, but plus minus 10%, we can say, yeah, it's about this old. When we get closer to the well, we have much, much shorter travel times, and we're going to be much less certain about exactly how many years that is. Something to keep in mind, because that means when we have nitrate in the well, we're not so sure whether it's from 5 years ago or 10 years ago, in addition to the fact that in the well, we get all of this mixing. So you can see there's already complications happening that we need to take into account. And just that understanding the mixing that's happening in the well is really, really important to understand the link between the source on one hand and the receptor on the other hand in this particular case. It's not like in a river where we get pollution going in and a day later it shows up at all the receptors, or you have a smoke plume coming off a chimney stack. You can actually watch it travel in the course of minutes or hours from that chimney stack. There's also uncertainty about the location of the source area. If this flow field is relatively uniform, we know that most of the recharge that eventually ends up coming out of this well is in this area, several miles upstream, but it could be from over here, or it could be from here, and we're less certain about that. So here, red indicates pretty certain that some of it is coming from here. The bluer colors indicate, yeah, maybe some is coming from here, but maybe not. So those are things that we don't know. We would have to do a lot of characterization of the aquifer between these sources and the well to make this more precise. That's a lot of site investigations, years of data collection, and very difficult to do. And people that have worked on Superfund sites, basically sites where we have point source pollution, one single plume, people that have worked on those know just how difficult that is. So again, in this picture, we have the sources at the land surface. They sent nitrate with recharge into the aquifer, and then the aquifer, we have that pathway, and it goes to the receptor, to the well. So we need to construct the legacy of this land use. We cannot just look at 2020 land use. We have to go back in time. And fortunately, we have digital maps of land use going back to the 1990s. We do have printed land use maps going further back. Those are really expensive to digitize. I'm not aware that anybody has done that. So what we have done for this groundwater nitrogen loading model for the Central Valley is we have taken this map of land use for about the early 1990s, late 1980s. We've taken the ag footprint, the colored areas in here, that is available in digital format, and we filled this in with the known area of these 50 different crops for which we have statistics in the Central Valley. So we have reconstructed land use, and we do things to sort of backcast the loading intensity from these different land uses that we have in the Central Valley all the way back to about 1940s, when much of that nitrate loading started, assuming that before that we had negligible amounts of nitrate in groundwater. So how much goes into groundwater is pretty much based on literature reviews, interviews, mapping that we have done as part of this work. We have numbers for urban areas, golf courses, corrals, et cetera, that are essentially fixed. These are averages. These are not the actual number at any particular site, something to keep in mind. And I should have put both a check mark and a tilde here. These are averages, and that's while we have the spatial distribution very precise, these numbers are indeed just that. They are averages, and they are coming with significant uncertainty. Same goes for septic systems and for wastewater treatment plants. We have an entire process on how we estimate the amount of manure that's land applied, be it on the dairy, what we call land application, be it off the dairy and other lands. We call that manure export. There's a lot of uncertainty around how much.
What is going on here? We don't understand.
That's why.
How much? Somebody has their microphone on, and I don't have my screen on. I think one of my co-hosts can probably mute them. There's a lot of uncertainty about how much nitrogen from that manure is actually going to make it on its way through the Vedos zone. And so for this particular source, we have built in a sensitivity tool where you can either have this source in operation as we estimate it, full force. We have the option for you to turn that down to half or to just ignore it altogether as a way to do sensitivity analyses around the uncertainty, just specifically to the manure, because there is so much uncertainty associated with it, and because it's plays such a dominant role in nitrate, groundwater nitrate in the Central Valley. As far as the crops are concerned, we're doing something very different. I'm going to pass the microphone to Bibas to talk about this. Bibas, you want to go ahead and tell us about this slide? I'm going to just keep this slide on. You don't have to share yours and use the pointer here, but if you can tell us about it.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. So, the model that you can see, the blueprint of, is basically Central Valley Groundwater Nitrogen Loading Model, CV-NPSAT, which accounts for the nitrogen that enters the groundwater. So it is a surface tool, to be honest. And then it runs for slightly over 21 million pixels of the Central Valley, each pixel being 0.25 hectares in area. And basically, everything on the top of the box are the sources, and everything at the bottom of the box are sinks. So when you make like the change between sources and sinks is basically the end leaching, which is the output. So now there are different sources like minor sources like atmospheric deposition, then atmospheric loss is the sink. Then there's irrigation, there's runoff. But the primary sources which has some uncertainty and which should be quantified very carefully are the fertilizer, which is basically reported to us by growers and experts as product like the synthetic fertilizer that they apply to their farms. And then there's a harvest, which is basically production per acre converted to nitrogen using some coefficients which depends on the moisture content of the crop. And then there's dairy, which is basically the organic fertilizer application, which is uncertain quantity, and we did a very good job of accounting it very well. And how dairy impacts crops, especially the field crops, we'll come to that in later slides. But this is a very coarse blueprint of what is happening in each of those 21 million pixels. Next slide, please. So we have accounted for 59 crops, which we'll show later. But in order to give you an aerial distribution of the crops, we have lumped them into 5 classes, as you can see. So 2 major takeaways from this figure. One is that as you slowly move from 1945 to 2020, you can see that the field crops, like mostly corn, different types of grains, wheat, barley, oats, they're slowly being replaced by orchard crops, which are fruits and nuts, because nuts is a major economic thing in the Central Valley. So it contributes to the GDP. And secondly, you see the rice and pasture has a very big patch in the northern part of the Central Valley, which we call the Sacramento Valley. It is important in terms of aerial coverage, but it has no importance in terms of nitrogen loading, because rice fields have like a lot of water stored in the root zone, and the infiltration is low because of clay soil, and also the denitrification is high, which means a lot of nitrogen goes back to the atmosphere. So strictly in terms of nitrogen leaching, rice and pasture does not impact a lot. Next slide, please. So these are the crops, and as you can see in the previous slide, they had some colors. So those colors are now represented in the outlining box. The codes are basically a very simple way DWR represents the crops. Like 3 means citrus, because C is 3. 4 is D, which is deciduous. So 3, 4. Then 2200 is basically 22, which is V, which is vineyards. So that's how all the crops are coded. And we have individual parameters for all of these crops in the CV-GNLM model, which gives us some annual snapshots of certain specific years of groundwater nitrogen loading. Next slide, please. So this is the groundwater nitrogen loading. And as you can see that for every snapshot year, we have 3 scenarios, which we call the full, half, and no manure scenario. Now, what is full, half, and no manure? It's basically like the quantification of dairy. That means if you consider the impact of dairy as a volume knob, then when it's 0, it's no manure. When it's 1, it's full manure. And when it's 0.5, which is the hypothetical median of no and full, it is half manure. And when in the earlier years, like up to the 1975, we do not see much change. But from 1990 to 2020, if we increase the quantity of dairy, you'll see that in the southeastern part of the valley. No. Go back here. In the southeastern part of the valley, you can see that there is a increased like redness, which means there is more loading. Now there are different sources of dairy. There are like land applied manure, which is like direct application of manure to field crops. Then there's exported manure. Then there's corrals and lagoons, which are basically where cows roam around and stuff. And those are mostly concentrated in the southeastern part. So this basically shows you that the application, the crop type only does not decide how much nitrogen is going to enter the groundwater. It strictly depends also on where the dairies are located and how much impact the dairy has on the leaching. Next slide, please. And as you can see in this slide, that depending on how much dairy we consider to be like impacting the crop type, the ranking of loading from different crop classes change. So if you apply like half manure or full manure, then the crop type that loads or leaches the most is basically the field crops. As you can see, they're yellow and high. This is the median. The uncertainty is also very huge. And when you consider no manure scenario, then vegetables and berries, which is also a very coarse crop class, it leaches higher. So that means like since field crops mostly receive the manure on spot, that means most of the dairy facilities has field crops growing around them. The moment you consider dairy, they are the major contributors to groundwater contamination. So this shows the importance of dairy. So I would like to present the dairy module as a structured indicator of loading pressure and a very useful attribution tool, rather than as a perfect measurement of exact nitrate loss from every dairy linked pixel. However, despite these uncertainties, this is still a very detailed and robust accounting framework for tracking the nitrogen loading entering groundwater. Thank you. Back to Thomas.
Thank you, Bybus. So Bybus already indicated these are not precise. They're as good as we can get. Some reasons why these numbers may differ from reality is we have to assume, because we have only 15-year or decadal snapshots of land use, we don't include crop rotations. The denitrification, as I already mentioned, of manure is a fairly big uncertainty. There's inaccuracy in the way things are reported, whether that's the dairy reports, whether this wastewater treatment plant reports, or farm reports on fertilizer use. Then we treat all crops we treat a crop, almonds or tomatoes. We treat all tomato fields the same way in terms of the amount of fertilizer applied, other than amendments, and the amount of harvest. We don't look at field to field or farm to farm differences in terms of tomato fertilization or tomato harvest. So that's a simplification that's in that model. We have a Central Valley-wide distributed map of atmospheric end deposition that people not in our lab have developed that accounts for some local variations sort of at the 5 to 10 mile scale, but it doesn't really account for very localized high atmospheric end deposition, which we may see especially near animal facilities. And then there is, of course, all the local variability in these other sources that we have in the groundwater nitrogen loading model, where we have a mean value, but where we don't consider their actual variability. So these are all sources of uncertainty and inaccuracy in this model, if you're really looking at a particular location. So that's the mass loading, the kilograms of nitrate nitrogen per hectare or the pounds of nitrate nitrogen per acre leaching each year into groundwater. That comes from this groundwater nitrogen loading model. Now, in order to get a concentration, we need to know recharge. Recharge is actually the flow of water from that landscape, from each of these sources going into groundwater. There's two sources of recharge that we consider. We consider the recharge out of the landscape that actually has nitrate with it. And that recharge comes from precipitation and irrigation, minus the evapotranspiration off of that precipitation and irrigation that the landscape vegetation does. So recharge is the difference between the sum of precipitation and irrigation on one hand and evapotranspiration on the other hand. And then we have recharge that includes seepage from canals, seepage from streams, and managed aquifer recharge. Those recharge sources carry negligible amounts of nitrate N as far as drinking water quality standards are concerned. And so this is essentially water that actually dilutes nitrate that comes from these other recharge, from these nitrate-containing recharge sources. So we consider these two separately. We take this recharge with the nitrate to calculate concentrations of nitrate going into groundwater. That recharge map looks something like this for the Central Valley. And Georgos will talk about this some more in his presentation, how we actually come up with this recharge map. This recharge map is highly detailed and on a scale that's even finer than a field. And it plays an important role because more recharge means the mass that's being lost from these sources is more diluted. If we have less recharge, that mass is less diluted, meaning higher concentrations. With that teaser on this recharge map, I'm going to pass the mic to Georgos to tell us more about the flow and transport along the pathways. Georgos, take it away.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So in the next slides, we're going to shift the focus from the sources to the pathways and eventually to the receptors. So, can you move to the next slide, please? Thanks. So this busy slide, actually gives a summary of how the NPSAT modeling framework conceptualized these pathways. So always the pathways in NPSAT start at the root zone, where the contaminants begin to percolate downwards into the unsaturated zone. In this zone, in the unsaturated zone, the main driving force is gravity. So nitrate and other diffuse pollutants move mostly straight down until they hit the water table, which here the water table is the dust blue line. Once they reach the water table, then the system becomes saturated after that, and the movement then is controlled by the groundwater flow. From that point on, the contaminants move mostly lateral, and actually they can travel actually for many years or even centuries, as Thomas showed before, and until they find an outlet. And this outlet is what we call receptors, and in NPSAT we consider irrigation, public supply wells, and domestic wells, as well as gaining streams as receptors. And now in the next slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about more detail how we model these two zones. So the first zone, which is the unsaturated zone, the first part essentially of the pathway occurs in the unsaturated zone, which is the region between, as we said, root zone and water table. And here we use a very simplified approach, which is called the piston flow model. This model essentially estimates how long it takes the contaminants to travel through the unsaturated zone using a very basic physical relationship between distance, velocity, and time. In our case, the distance is the depth to the groundwater. In Central Valley, this depth, as we can see in the left map, varies quite a bit, and it's known that the depth of the unsaturated zone in the southern part it's greater. And so this map here actually combines measured data from the Department of Water Resources with simulated depths from regional groundwater models, and essentially defines how far the contaminants need to travel before they reach the water table. So the speed of this movement is controlled by the deep percolation or the groundwater recharge, which is shown in the middle map. And now, if we do simple math, we just divide the depth distance by the recharge rate velocity, we estimate actually the time, so how long it takes for the water and the contaminants that move with it to reach the water table. Now, the piston flow model has also one additional parameters that influences this travel time, and this is the water content, often also is called theta. And this parameter is actually something that the user can configure in the web application, so I think it's worth mentioning briefly what is the role. So you can think as water content as a parameter that controls the pore space that is available for the water in the unsaturated zone to move into. The larger the water content, the more space you have. And since you have more space, the same amount of water is going to move slower. So larger values of water content slows down the travel time, the traveling in the unsaturated zone. If you have narrower pore spaces, which means we have less water content, then the same amount of water has to move much quicker. So the essentially smaller values of water content speed up the whole process in the unsaturated transport. So also we have an earth engine application that Thomas I think is going to show it in a little bit more detail about that, where one can explore and actually have a good look at the data that we use. To conclude the discussion about the unsaturated transport, I want to point out what the role of this tool is actually in the NPSAT. This tool acts simply as a time delay. It essentially delays when the contaminants are going to reach the aquifer, the water table, and does not change the concentration along the way. So next slide, please. And
by the way, Georgos,
Thomas?
can you see my pointer when I have the pointer on the screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
I can see.
perfect.
Yeah.
Good.
So once the contaminants reach the water table, they start actually carried by the groundwater flow within the aquifer. The flow in the saturated part of the system is much more complicated, as it depends on many factors such as pumping, interactions with streams, groundwater recharge, and of course, the complexity of the underlying geology. Because of all of these factors, the only practical way to estimate groundwater movement at a large scale is actually by using a numerical model, a numerical groundwater model that simulates groundwater flow. Now, it is important to remember that numerical models are always simplified representations of reality. The way I like to think a numerical model is like a very low resolution, digital photo resolution, with very low resolution of an actual painting. It captures the main features, but it's still an approximation. So the resolution in numerical model refers essentially to how fine we divide the model into grid cells and compute quantities into these cells. In general, higher resolution gives us more detail and potentially more accurate result, but also makes the models more computationally demanding and they require more data. So when you develop a model, there is always a trade-off between resolution and the model development cost. Now I want to shift the focus on the next figure, which illustrates essentially what this trade-off means for pathways that connect sources to a well. Here in this example, I have simulated the pathways that feed an irrigation well using different model resolutions. We see that the coarser case, which is around 3,000 foot resolution, the simulated pathways are shown in blue. Then I cut in half, I increase in the resolution to 1500 feet, and the pathways are now shown in green. And as you can see, with at both of these refinement level, the paths appear much narrower compared to the very high resolution run, where actually the resolution was actually almost 10 times finer than the ones in the blue. So this example shows that how important the resolution can become when we try to identify which sources are connected to each particular receptor or well. In NPSAT, to address this challenge, we develop our own simulation code that is actually based on a method that is called adaptive mesh refinement. In this method, we use a very high resolution near the wells and where the detail matter most. Actually, this was supposed to play an animation where this should be refined.
There we go. Does it play now? On your end?
It plays. Yes. Okay, that's great. Thanks. And so as you can see, actually, that the resolution near the wells and the streams, they increase significantly, whereas in other areas, actually, they remain pretty coarse. And essentially, we increase the resolution where it matters most to identify the pathways. And this actually allows us to keep the simulation high resolution, but still computationally manageable. Next slide, please.
And Georg, can I ask you, can you still see the mouse?
I can still see the mouse, yes.
Okay, cool.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you.
So after we have actually done with the simulating the groundwater flow field, we know how it moves in the aquifer. We can use particle tracking to identify the pathways that connect sources and receptors. Actually, in the model, we do it in the reverse order. Instead of starting at the source, we release particles near the receptors, near the wells, and then we trace their paths backwards through the groundwater system to see where the water actually originally came from. In this figure that Thomas points out, we are looking in an aquifer as if we were studying inside that. So the green vertical straws represent well screens, and those the lines that are colored with cyan and reddish colors, or which look like tubes, essentially are the groundwater pathways that feed this particular well. And at the top of the figure is the agricultural landscapes, which represents the potential source area. So essentially, particle tracking links receptor and sources via groundwater pathways. However, there is another important question here. How long does it take for contaminants to travel along those pathways? So if contamination, for example, occurs at the surface today, and I think Thomas already touched on that, they are not going to immediately show up in the well. First, it has to move through the unsaturated zone, continue traveling through the groundwater system. And also, during this journey of the contaminant plume is going to spread out due to dispersion. So the concentration is going to change over time. Yet the total mass we expect to be the same unless there are chemical reactions along the way. So to estimate how this spreading happens, we simulate the transport for each one pathway individually by solving the one-dimensional advection dispersion equation. So assuming that the input source is 1 unit. So this actually, using this way, we don't really need to know when we construct the model what the source is. We can still use just a unit input to simulate. The result of this actually simulation is what we call the unit response function, or URF. Essentially, a URF describes how a unit input of contamination at the source would arrive at the well over time. It's going to tell us when it's going to arrive, how large the peak of that concentration is going to be, and how it declines after the peak. Typically, the typical behavior of a unit response function is that either sharply or gradually increases at their early times, reaches a peak, and then slowly decreases, often with a long tail that represents a delayed transport. You can see in the figure on the bottom figure some examples of such unit response functions. One very useful feature of those unit response functions is that they can be summarized with just 2 parameters, essentially by knowing the average travel time and the spread of travel times along that pathway, we can actually reconstruct this shape. And essentially, what this means that all the complexity of this pathway can be summarized with just 2 parameters. So next slide, please. So in this slide, I'm going to explain how actually we use this information to make predictions. To add here is that the previous slide are actually corresponds to the construction of the NPSAT, and now this is the use of NPSAT. The construction takes quite a lot of time to do it, but the NPSAT predictions are actually are executed very rapidly. So the source model provides us a time series of nitrate loading at the land surface. Essentially, they estimate how much nitrate is entering into the groundwater each year. From the flow and transport simulation, we know that each pathway has its own unit response function. So now let's consider this simple 4-step example, 4-time-step example. Suppose that the nitrate in the first year, shown in blue, is 10 units. To estimate its effect at the receptor at the well, we simply take the unit response function, which is the gray, and actually represents the pathway, and we multiply it by 10. And the result is the blue breakthrough curve shown in the right figure. Yep. Next year, the loading becomes 25, and it's shown now in green. Again, we use the same URF. We scale it by 25, but this time we shifted 1 year forward because the contamination released a year later also should arrive a year later at the receptor. We repeat the process for the red and for the purple. We essentially multiply by their magnitudes and shift it as many years as needed. And we repeat this process, and once actually we have completed all the time series, the final predicted concentration of the receptor is simply the sum of all of those individual contributions, which is represented here by the black curve. This process is known as convolution, and it's executed very fast. It only requires arithmetic operations and can be executed very fast. And also for different pathways, they can be executed in parallel. So that's why we can be very efficient now. One important point that I would like to make here is that the concentration that we see at the receptor at every given time is actually a mixture of contamination released at many different times in the past. So this process essentially mixes contaminant inputs over time as they travel through the groundwater system. Okay, next slide. So in NPSAT, each receptor or each well is connected to a large number of pathways. The top left figure shows an example of a well shown in red dot, and the starting points of the pathways that feed this particular well as yellow dots. Each of these starting points correspond to a location at the land surface where the recharge enters the system. For each of these pathways, we associate 2 things: a nitrate loading time series and a unit response function that describes how contamination travels along that pathway. Also, I would like to make a comment here with respect to the figure that Thomas showed before, where it didn't have any well. Here you can see actually that the sources are split into 2 halves. Can you go to the next slides, Thomas? Yeah. Notice here that the sources divided into 2 parts. That's because between those 2 sources there is another well that intervened the source area of that well. Yes. So we know that for each dot there is a loading time series, and we know that there is a unit response function that we have already pre-calculated. We do the convolution, and we calculate for each of these yellow dots the concentration breakthrough curve for each pathway, and these are the ones that Thomas shows as thin gray lines. In order to calculate the concentration of the well, we actually calculate the flow-weighted average of all of those individual streamline concentrations. Now, in theory, NPSAT could predict concentration for a single well or even for a different zone depths within a well. However, the primary purpose of this model is actually to support regional scale assessment. For example, we might look at the entire township or even larger areas. In this example, the township zone here is located in the southern central valley and includes about 130 wells. And each one well has its own source area and its own predicted concentration breakthrough curve using this convolution approach. But however, instead of focusing on a single well, we analyze the results statistically across all wells in the region. And this allows us actually to answer questions such as what the percentage of well might exceed a certain nitrate threshold, when this might occur, and later we are going to actually see more questions that we can address. Now, I want to highlight another important point here. As you can see, I have a tilde in the top row, which means that I characterize essentially the prediction for a single well as uncertain. The main reason for that is that the pathways that we have calculated are deterministic. They represent one specific set of flow conditions. In reality, however, those pathways can shift left and right or can contract or expand over time because of the changes in pumping and recharge and climate conditions.
And Georgos, if I can add there, the other thing is looking at this picture at the top, if you think about the aquifer below this picture, it typically in these alluvial aquifers, which are basically like a bunch of sediments sitting in a bathtub, they're highly heterogeneous, and there's just no way we would ever know exactly what the architecture of the aquifer is below, and we have to make assumptions and simplify the architecture of that aquifer below. And to the degree we do so, we also simplify what the pathways are between the yellow dots where the recharge occurs in the well, and where the water comes back out. So that's another part of the uncertainty about these flow paths. And the only way we would have to, we could ever resolve that is by doing a lot of site investigation to understand the exact structure of the aquifer system. Go ahead, Georgos.
Sure. Thanks. And so if we move from a single well prediction to many wells across a region, then the predictions are dominated by the mixed water over both time and space. So each well receives water from many different pathways, and each pathway reflects contamination from different locations and different times in the past. So when we look at many wells together, this mixing tends to average out the variability and the uncertainty in the individual pathways. So instead of relying on a single, potentially uncertain prediction, we are looking at the overall distribution of concentration across many wells, which is more stable and more reliable. And this actually concludes my presentation about NPSAT modeling framework. Right. So far, I haven't discussed anything about Central Valley. This is a general framework about NPSAT. So can you move in the next slide? But before moving, yes, I would like actually now to talk a little bit about some few key assumptions behind the model, which are also very important to keep in mind when we are using it. So the first assumption is that we treat the groundwater flow system as stationary, both in the unsaturated zone and in the aquifer. In other words, we assume that the overall flow patterns do not change significantly over time. The second assumption is that the contaminant sources are distributed across the landscape, and their magnitudes are also pretty much in the same order. The model is designed to simulate non-point source pollution, such as agricultural night loading, and it is not intended to simulate localized point sources. Another important assumption is related to the time scale. NPSAT is designed to evaluate long-term groundwater quality trends, typically over decades to centuries. In the same way, it is meant NPSAT to estimate long-term effects of management actions. It's not really focused on daily or seasonal fluctuations, but rather how things evolve over the very long run. And finally, the model is actually developed for regional assessments. Regional does not have necessarily, these regions don't have to be very large. They can be something like a township or even smaller than a township under certain conditions, but the model is meant to evaluate patterns across many wells and sources rather than focusing on individual locations. So now we have talked about NPSAT. Now we are going to talk a little bit about CV-NPSAT, which is the Central Valley application of the modeling framework. So the development of CV-NPSAT relies heavily on two existing regional groundwater models, the CVHM2, which was developed by the US Geological Survey, and the C2V-SIM that is developed by the California Department of Water Resources. Both of these models are transient. They simulate how the groundwater system changes over time. They cover roughly the last 40 years, and they operate at a rather coarse spatial resolution. Their resolution is about 1 square mile. This regional model estimates many important components of the groundwater system, including pumping, recharge, and groundwater storage, and many others. So here in this figure, we can see the model, the estimation of this model of the cumulative groundwater storage change with respect of the year 1974. We can see that both models show very good agreement in the recent year regarding the groundwater storage depletion. This is the black lines there, essentially. We can see that over the last 10 to 15 years, they both estimate that Central Valley Aquifer has been losing groundwater storage at a rate of about 2.5 million acre-feet per year. And so this raises an important point because NPSAT is designed to simulate transport process over a very long time scales, often centuries. So if current conditions persist, aquifer depletion becomes the main problem, and nitrate actually would become not a secondary issue anymore. So addressing the nitrate pollution in the long term is only meaningful if only the groundwater sustainability has been achieved. And since we know that there is no simple solution for that. Under current conditions, we know that more water is being pumped from the aquifer than being replenished. Yep. And then achieving sustainability ultimately requires to bring recharge and pumping these two quantities into balance. And for the purpose of NPSAT development, or CV-NPSAT, we consider two extreme scenarios that can serve as bounding cases for other more realistic management strategies. The first scenario assumes that groundwater pumping is reduced until it matches the current level of recharge. And the second scenario assumes the opposite. We increase the recharge until it matches the current pumping levels. Using these assumptions, we develop a total of 4 CV-NPSAT models, two extreme sustainability scenarios, I should say, applied to the two parent models. So we have a total of four Central Valley high-resolution flow fields. And next slide. So these 4 balanced versions of the Central Valley groundwater models is the starting point for developing the high-resolution groundwater flow field with NPSAT. This regional model provides all the information we need, but their spatial resolution is about 1 square mile, which is not sufficient for simulating contaminant transport. So to address this, actually we developed special downscaling methods. The idea of those methods is actually take information from the coarse regional model and redistribute it at a much finer spatial scale so that it can be used in our high resolution model. In Central Valley, the two most important drivers of groundwater flow is the pumping and the groundwater recharge. So the downscale focused on those two quantities. For groundwater extraction, the regional model reports the pumping at the level of at the 1 square mile cells. In NPSAT, we took those pumping and we redistributed to individual wells using the well completion reports from the Department of Water Resources. Because the well completion reports have a lot of missing data, we developed also methods to handle this missing or incomplete data so that we constructed a 3D distribution of wells or receptors in a way that actually reflects what one would expect to see in reality. For groundwater recharge, we downscale the coarse recharge estimates of these two models approximately to a field scale using a very high resolution surface water model from a SWAT simulation. So this very high, this downscaled pumping and recharge data sets were used as inputs to adaptively refine groundwater model, and we simulated the groundwater flow field at a much finer resolution, about 150 to 200 feet horizontally, and one to 15 feet vertically. The simulations are quite large. Each model consists of 120 and 130 million elements and cannot be executed on a single PC. So we carried out those at the UC Davis high performance cluster. Next, we use those high resolution flow fields to run our transport simulation. For each model, we computed approximately 4 million groundwater pathways, which define connections between the sources and the receptors. And the receptors include 22,000 irrigation wells, 2.5 thousand public supply wells, and roughly about 55,000 domestic wells. Finally, for each pathway, we also pre-computed the corresponding unit response function, which allow us now to simulate contaminant transport very efficiently. Next slide.
Does it show up?
Yep, that's. So besides the pumping and the deep percolation, there are a few additional processes that play an important role in groundwater management and in simulating the nitrate transport. So it's worth briefly to explain those. The first one is managed aquifer recharge. The regional groundwater model that we use as a starting point, they already simulate many of the MAR sites at their native resolution of 1 square mile. For each coarse model cell, they estimate how much water enters. Part of that water moves through the root zone in the unsaturated zone before reaching the groundwater, and this portion represents the typical irrigation recharge. Another portion is actually directly applied to the aquifer bypassing the unsaturated zone. And in regional model, this is actually referred to as direct recharge and essentially represent the managed aquifer recharge. Since the parent model provides both of these quantities, we can estimate the fraction of the recharge that comes from MAR. In other words, we can calculate the percentage of direct recharge relative to the total recharge reaching the groundwater. In NPSAT, we use this factor, this dilution factor, during the prediction stage. If a portion of water reaching the groundwater comes from MAR, has very low nitrate, and so it was going to dilute the loading entering the aquifer, the nitrate entering the aquifer. Here in those three maps, on the left one, you can see actually the deep percolation. This is the deep percolation part that moves through the unsaturated zone and represents irrigation. And the middle one represents the direct recharge component, which is MAR. And here in this area, I have highlighted, actually I have chosen specifically this area, which is the Kern County, and it's well known for its managed recharge infrastructure. And finally, the total recharge reaching the groundwater is essentially a combination of those two components. However, move it into the next slide, please. Yep. So when we look ahead, we expect that more managed aquifer recharge projects will be implemented as part of the effort to address the groundwater sustainability. And these new MAR projects or potential MAR projects are not currently represented in the regional groundwater models, and therefore they are not considered in the current NPSAT simulations. So introducing a new MAR site would affect the system essentially in two main ways. First, it would affect the groundwater flow field. Adding a new source of recharge means that some of that water would eventually become part of the groundwater pathways that supply the nearby wells or other receptors. Secondly, the MAR would affect the dilution of nitrate concentrations because the MAR will increase the percentage of direct recharge. So the question is, can NPSAT be used to account for new MAR project? So as far as dilution effect is concerned, this is very straightforward. We can simply update the dilution factors using new recharge inputs. However, we cannot modify the groundwater flow field that easy. Actually, doing that properly requires to rerun the entire full groundwater flow and transport simulation, which are computationally quite demanding. So to address questions using NPSAT, MAR-related questions with NPSAT, we have taken so far two approaches. The first one is to rerun simulation using the recharge adjusted scenario, but in this case, instead of the spreading the original recharge adjustment is shown in the middle one, is the middle map. But here in this case, instead of actually spreading the extra water that is required to match the pumping, instead of spreading everywhere across the Central Valley, we applied it only to the areas with are actually well suited for MAR based on the SWRCB index. This gives us an alternative flow scenario that represents a kind of upper bound or an extreme case MAR, large-scale MAR implementation across the entire Central Valley. However, at a more local scale, we can still modify the dilution factors and define buffer zones around the proposed MAR projects where the dilution effect would apply. Here, the idea is that nearby wells would gradually begin to draw water from these new MAR sites. We have used a similar approach to get first estimates of proposed MAR site in the McMullen area, and we acknowledge that these are rough, but they can give us a first look in the long-term benefits and help answer some initial questions. Yep. Next slide. Another important part of the groundwater flow in Central Valley is, of course, the interaction between rivers and the aquifer. Here we have used the existing river network from the regional models, which include all major rivers and all their tributaries. And we identify where the water is leaving the aquifer into the rivers and where the water is entering the aquifer from the rivers. And actually, this interaction is very important for the water quality. In NPSAT, what we are actually, the way we consider stream loading is actually, if the pathway starts very close to a river, we assume that the water has very low nitrate concentration. As we move further away, the influence of the river decreases to account for the mixing of dilution between the river and the other nitrate sources. So this is our simplistic way to actually for NPSAT to capture the dilution effect caused by stream aquifer interactions. And another process that move to the next slide, please. Yeah. Another important process is actually denitrification. In simple terms, denitrification is the process by which the nitrate typically is naturally reduced and removed from in the subsurface, typically under low oxygen conditions. In this slide, we show the map of denitrification potential with values ranging from 0 to 1. Higher values indicate the areas where the conditions are more favorable for the nitrate to be removed. These are actually the red zone. In NPSAT, we use this information in a rather simplified way. If a well is located in an area where the denitrification potential is greater than about, let's say, 80%, we assume that most of nitrate is effectively removed before reaching the well. So in those areas, the predicted concentration are significantly reduced. And however, this is a simplification and allow us to account for natural attenuation of nitrate at the regional scale. Also, for the simulation that Thomas is going to show today, this is not a feature that we have implemented yet, but is coming very, very soon in the next week.
And I should add, Yorgos, that this one should be 100. So we're talking about 100% denitrification here and 100% denitrification on the left on that color scale. The red indicating where we have essentially very large amounts of denitrification and no detection of nitrate in wells.
Okay.
All right.
So before moving on, I would like also to briefly highlight what CV-NPSAT is not designed for and what actually should not be used for, right? So the model is not appropriate for small-scale site investigation. CV-NPSAT is a regional assessment tool and does not have the level of detail needed to evaluate conditions at a single property or a specific field. Similarly to that, the model is not intended to simulate small-scale contamination plumes. These types of problems require actually very detailed local models and site-specific data. Another limitation actually is the seasonal pumping. In NPSAT, we assume that groundwater flow patterns are relatively stable over the long periods of time. The model is designed to capture long-term trends and not short-term variations such as seasonal pumping cycles. And last is that CV-NPSAT should not be used to guide management decision at the individual grower level. The model does not have the level of certainty needed to support decision at a single farm. Instead, the strength of the CV-NPSAT is answering regional questions such as how groundwater quality might evolve across a township, subbasin, or a larger area, or how different management strategies might affect those long-term trends. Okay, next slide, please. Yep. So far, we have covered quite a few details about what NPSAT is and what CV-NPSAT is, and how actually we can use those models to estimate impact at the wells. So a very important question, a very natural question to anyone at this point is, does this actually work? And so in the next few slides, we walk you through of the efforts that we have tried to answer this question. So in this slide, we're going to focus on two key assumptions behind the model. The first assumption is the assumption of stationarity, or in other words, how much error we introduced by assuming that the groundwater flow system does not change significantly over time. The second assumption is that the use of streamline-based transport approach. Here we want to understand how well the simpler method compares to the more traditional full 3D advection dispersion model. For this comparison, we evaluated NPSAT against a well-established modeling framework, which is ModFlow coupled with MT3D. Our study area is located in the center of the Central Valley, around the cities of Modesto and Turlock. In this first figure at the left, we compare the distribution of concentration across all wells in the study area, and we show here the percentiles over time. Here the results of NPSATs are shown with red, and the steady-state MT3D simulation is shown with blue. We can see that at early times, those two models have some differences. Generally, NPSAT tends to predict earlier arrivals because it operates at a much higher spatial resolution and captures faster pathways compared to a coarser model that smooths that out. But when we look at the long-term behavior, the agreement between the two models actually is very strong. Both approaches tell exactly the same story in terms of how groundwater quality evolves over time. We see there's some difference at the higher end, around the 95th percentile, but overall, the long-term management questions, for long-term management questions, these two models are very consistent. For example, we can see that both models indicate that concentrations are going to increase over the first several decades, up to 50 to 60 years, and then they begin to level off. And these are something that both models agree. However, one important difference between these two models is the computational cost. NPSAT simulation took just seconds, whereas the comparable MT3D simulation took actually many hours or even days. Then we extend the comparison to transient simulations, where flow conditions change over time. And here again, we observe similar patterns. There are still some difference if you zoom into a specific percentiles, but all the models converge on the same overall trends, and sometimes even in similar magnitudes, and essentially they tell the same long-term story. And now I'm going to give the floor to Zendan to explain his efforts for validation.
Thank you, Georgos. Go ahead, Zendan.
Thank you. So in order to validate the nitrate concentration against NPSAT, first we want to know the velocity for our flow field, which is controlled by the vapor zone water content and the saturated zone porosities. So we simulate a tritium, which is a groundwater age tracer, under different combination of porosity and water content. And then we use this different combination result to compare with our measured tritium in the aquifer system. So we compare with the mean, and we compare with the distribution distance, which is the Wasserstein distance. So we just try to find out which combination of porosity and water content can best describe our aquifer system in the Central Valley. So as you can see, for the mean, like in the Sacramento subbasin, we generally pick like a 50% porosity. because it's close to the mean and it also has a very small error in the water sun distance. And in the San Joaquin Valley as a basin, we pick the 40% porosity with like 20% water content. And then in the Tula Lake Basin, we pick up the 20% porosity with like 20 water content. So with this, then we can move to the nitrate validation. So this, we validated the nitrate observed data. We have like almost 400,000 of well records from 1940s to 2020. And then we compare with the NPSAT simulation data. And as we can see here, we can capture the overall, like the trend. The median is very close in 3 subbasins. And the range is also very close. So I think it's a very good performance in order to say like the NPSAT can actually reproduce the trend of nitrate in the Central Valley system. Thank you.
Thank you, Zindan.
Yep.
Back to Georgos.
Thank you. Yes, so now we are getting close to the end of this first part of the presentation. So I would like to actually briefly say a little bit about a few additional capabilities of CV-NPSAT. So in the next section, we're going to demonstrate the web tool. In this tool, every time you click run, there is a server actually running in the background, which is a server application that's called Mandis. And Mandis server receives the input data from the user, runs the very fast simulation using the pre-computed URFs, and then returns the predicted concentration back to the user. However, the Mandis server is also available outside of the web tool and can be downloaded from our GitHub repository. We have developed scripting interfaces in Python, MATLAB, and R so that users can build and run their own scenarios programmatically. Here you can see in this figure, for example, I'm showing actually how one can use this interface to run a scenario with Python and MATLAB. It all requires actually a few commands, a few lines of code. So this scripting workflows provides a much more flexibility than the web tools where the users actually have to rely on the default settings. For example, instead of modifying the nitrate loading at the crop level, you can modify it at a much finer scale down to about 50-meter grid cells, which allows actually to design scenarios in more details. You can also modify things like the stream concentration or dilution factors, which is useful for marsh scenario evaluation. Another advantage of scripting is that it allows you to run many scenarios automatically without manual intervention. This is especially useful for sensitivity analysis where you want to run actually hundreds of scenarios, or even when you want to couple the model with an optimization workflow. At the moment, the web tool provides access specifically to CV-NPSAT model. However, when using the server directly, you can work with other models such as the Modesto that we showed in the validation, or the Tule River model, which is another one. And also, it is possible to use alternative nitrate loading data sets. For example, in the past applications, we have used nitrate loading generated from a SWAT model. So overall, this framework actually gives us a great, this standalone server, let's say, gives a great deal of flexibility and control, but with this flexibility comes a responsibility. So to ensure that the model is used correctly, we allow access to the full CV-NPSAT datasets only upon request. And that's the only way we do this is, the only reason we do this is because we want to have one last opportunity to guide the users and help avoid misuse. And last few slides, to the next one. So the development of NPSAT is still ongoing. It's a very much an active effort. One of the main developments right now is the new version that is called Mandis-SA, which stands for SALT. And this is a standalone application. It's not a server-based, and it's focused specifically on salinity transport. A key feature of this version is that it can represent feedback mechanism, particularly the recycling of salts through the irrigation, which is important in the salt simulation in Central Valley. And yes, in the next slide. And also we are working on updating the core flow and transfer model. In this new version, we are moving away from the finite element approach that we have used so far, and we adopt a more advanced method, which is called hybridized mixed finite elements. Without going into the details about this method, this is going to allow us to better represent certain processes, for example, the wellbore flow, which can be important in some areas in the Central Valley, or at least it's something that we want to evaluate more rigorously. We also exploring the possibility of introducing cyclical transient approach where flow conditions vary in repeating patterns while still keeping the model computationally efficient. In addition to that, we are planning several data updates, including incorporating wellbore flow from abandoned wells, inside the abandoned wells. We are going to update the groundwater recharge and pumping based on the latest available data. And we are going to update the CV-HM2 and build the newest version of C2V Sim. Another important directions of this new version is actually we want to better incorporate the latest groundwater sustainability plans in our simulations so that the model essentially reflects the current and future management, the actual future management strategies. So this is a great time to engage, and if you have questions, concerns, or ideas that you think that we should consider, we really welcome your input as we move forward with the next generation of CV-NPSAT, and we provide mechanisms through the web tool actually to share feedback, or you can simply send emails. Thank you very much. Back to you, Thomas.
Thank you. Well, that was great. I'm going to stop sharing here. Giorgos, Sindan, and Baiba's excellent presentation. Dory, were there any quick questions that we should answer at this point?
Let's see. Christopher Martin says, for nitrate sources, is there the ability to include the land application of wastewater that contains nitrates?
That's a good question. So the land application, we have several land applications of nitrogen from wastewater sources. We cover the wastewater treatment plants, both the percolation ponds and the wastewater application from wastewater treatment plants and the biosolids applications. They're all included in the model. They are specific to each of the I forget the exact numbers. We had about 180 or so wastewater treatment plants and 80 food processors. So the same goes for food processors, which would have either percolation ponds or wastewater applications to agricultural lands. Those are mapped out, and we have used the permitted amounts of waste being processed. Those numbers is what we use to estimate how much nitrate is going through that system, or how much nitrogen is going through the system, and how much nitrate may be percolating either out of percolation ponds or out of land application areas. For the manure, the land application areas are mapped out by the individual dairies and correspond to the amount of land that dairies have available to spread the manure on, and the number of animals that they report to have on site. The number of animals determines the amount of nitrogen that's excreted. There are significant atmospheric losses, and there's uncertainty about those atmospheric losses, which is one of the reasons why we have these 3 dairy scenarios. And then there's the land application on the dairies themselves, and then to the degree that dairies report nitrate as being exported, and that is in fact in this nitrogen loading model accounts for the export reported. We take an average export. I think we don't. I forget whether we have the actual number from each dairy or whether we use an average. But that exported nitrogen is then basically applied as an amendment across the county that the dairy is located in. We don't do we don't know where that export goes generally, and so we just distribute it across the county. So those are in there. The scripting tool that Giorgos last mentioned allows for a user to actually have their own loading map, develop their own loading map at whatever detail down to the 50-meter pixel that is 150-foot pixel that they want, and apply it. And also the time series of that they can have every year, they can change, they can have a 50-year, 100-year time series of maps at that resolution if they have the data for it.
Oh, okay. The other question is, what would be involved in using this model in a different area if it already has the pieces like the groundwater model, nitrate loading data, etc., available?
Yes, that's a great question. And let me just go back to maybe this picture. So what's involved in this is a flow model, and then running the streamlines on that flow model. And so it would be doing the same steps that we have done in the Central Valley, really Yorgos has done in the Central Valley. Is this is the Central Valley aquifer system here from Bakersfield all the way to Reading. We would take the existing flow models, the fluxes across the boundaries on the side, the fluxes across the boundaries on the top. So that's recharge, and then from within the aquifer, it's all the pumping from all the wells. We would take that from an existing model, and if there is ways we can refine, especially the pumping, we could go to DWR records, or if it's out of state, we could go to the state agency's records on well permits. If there are refined tools on recharge, we could apply those, build those, and then calculate the streamlines and unit response functions. In terms of hours and in terms of how much work that is, that would depend on the individual case.
One last question right now is, could one account for seasonal pumping by running the model twice, once with wells pumping and again with wells not pumping, and then combining the regional values to get a regional average?
Yeah, that's a great question. That doesn't work in that way. Yorgos, you want to talk a little bit about how you're thinking about testing whether we can do a seasonal cycle with the NPSAT?
Yes, actually, this approach, although at first it sounds a really good idea, I just realized that it's not going to work for a simple reason. When you shut down the wells, there is not going to be any water that actually is going to move through those. So the backward particle tracking doesn't really make any sense, because actually there is not going to be water involved in the well there. So so we are considering, as I said in the last few slides, we are considering actually the seasonal pumping to take into account. Actually, we're trying to see whether we can actually do instead of steady state version as we do right now, let's say to simulate 5 years, for example, seasonal 5 years. But again, the recharge and the pumping has to be balanced over those 5 years. We're just going to explore, let's say, the seasonal variation in the monthly seasonal variation between the in a flow conditions that are almost steady state, are balanced, actually, are balanced. This is what we are trying to do.
And just to reinforce, we are in this tool representing the average pumping over the year. So if a well, to the degree that a well pumps 1,000 gallons per minute for irrigation from April to September for 6 months, and then is off from October to March, in the model that's represented not as 1,000 gallons per minute all the time, that's represented as 500 gallons per minute all the time, because that's if you pump half the year at 1,000 and you pump nothing for the other half of a year, on average, that's 500 gallons per minute. Any other questions, Story, that we should look at right now?
That's it for now. Thank you.
Okay, then let me walk you through this web tool today. Before I do, just a really quick reminder, this is about sources, pathways, and receptors. And it's about flow rates and mass or concentration of nitrate. All of this is built into this tool. And what this tool does is, and this is really all there is to it, is we will pick an area of interest, and there's different options, which we'll learn about. For this area of interest, we can pick one or many of about 50 different crops and change the loading that comes from that crop for a future scenario, not in the past, but in the future. Push the button, let the tool do what it needs to do to look at the pathways and the outcomes at the receptors, and then it will display to us results, and I'll walk you through how we select the source area, how we select these crops, and then how to interpret what comes out from this tool. As Jorgos already mentioned, there's a number of questions that you might be interested in answering with this tool. You could ask, what is the contribution of a particular crop to nitrate in wells of my area of interest? Something you can, and there's different ways to approach this. One way to approach this is to turn all loading from everything else except for that particular crop to 0, and keep that crop at where it is. And that would give you sort of the incremental contribution of that crop to well nitrate. Or you do the opposite. You leave everything on and you just turn crop X off, which will show you how much less nitrate you would have if that crop doesn't have any nitrate discharge, which again also gives you that incremental difference. You could also ask, what will it take to get nitrate in half the wells, or 75% of the wells, or 90% of the wells to below the drinking water limit? One thing to keep in mind is that the predictions are going to be most reliable for sort of that bulk part of wells, so the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile of the concentration distribution. To predict the extreme ends is going to be much more difficult, and I'll get back to that later. You can look at, and this is where this tool is has been already used in the context of selecting potential targets. If we do realistic reductions in crop management and resulting nitrate loading, where do we end up with water quality? And then corresponding to that, as Georgos mentioned, the tool doesn't allow to say, okay, I have one particular field, unless you take the scripting tool and build it yourself. But in this web tool, you can't just pick one field and say, I want to see what this field does relative to the nitrate in a particular well. That's not what this tool is designed for. But if I'm growing almonds and I'm looking at my irrigated lands nutrient management plan, and I look at the tables that have been published by the regional water boards on the distribution of what we call A-R, the applied nitrogen minus the removed nitrogen. And I can see that relative to the average, I'm about 20% better, or I'm 30% worse. As a grower, I could ask the question, well, if everybody else did this, that grows salmons, what would nitrate in groundwater look like? How would it be different? Those are the kind of questions we can answer with this tool. All right, so we'll eventually have this on this website. You can't go there. You can go there right now, but you can't log in. We'll roll this out early next week, and we'll send you an email. When you have registered and you have a password, you log in through the screen, you'll get a disclaimer that you'll have to confirm. And that just basically says that you understand that what this model does, and that you have an understanding that it's not meant to predict what a particular action does to a particular well, because it's not designed for that. And then you end up on this home screen. Now, I've played with this tool quite a bit, and I have a lot of different scenarios that I have already on this tool. When you first get there, this table here will be empty, and you will go straight to this create scenario one, and I'll talk about this thing then therefore later. So you get to this home screen just before I go there, always on the upper left-hand corner. You can always click on this and it'll get you to this home screen. But let's go ahead and click on create scenario. And that will bring up this screen here. On these screens, you can see that you basically have 1, 2, 3. There's 4 screens that you have to fill out. They're fairly straightforward. There's nothing complicated about it. And on all these screens, you will see instructions at the bottom on these individual fields. You will also see these information buttons. And when you move with your information button over this, there will be pop-up menus that will give you more information about, in this case, for example, the default values. So this first screen is about setting up your flow model. As Georgos mentioned, we have a number of different flow models, 4 to be exact in here. We have 2 flow models that are based on C2-VSIM, one where pumping is adjusted and one where recharge is adjusted. And then we have the same thing with CVHM2, which is the USGS model of the Central Valley, one where pumping is adjusted to match with recharge and one where recharge is adjusted to match with pumping. You can select which one of these you want. You can also run scenarios with all 4 of them and then compare them against each other. Then next is, so I have some instructions here on the left that I will not go into in detail. Maybe one thing to mention is well, just to go back, what we're using, and just to repeat this from what Georgos had explained earlier, what we're using from CVHM and C2-VSIM is at the scale of what we call individual subregions, or what CVHM calls farms, and the Central Valley is divided into 21 water counting subregions. At these regions, and one of them is shown here, we take the recharge and the pumping that is coming from C2-VSIM or from CVHM, and we refine it so that over that region, we still have the same pumping and the same recharge, but it's now distributed in a much more detailed way for wells using the DWR, well construction records, and for recharge using the Formation Environmental, which is a consulting firm that has worked with the Agricultural Water Quality Coalitions to develop a Central Valley SWAT tool with very detailed recharge. It's that information that plays into both the C2-VSIM and CVHM simulations. So you have these options to use these. So the next line, once you have selected that, then you select the porosity. So you'll see 2 inputs, one called porosity, one called water content. The porosity refers to the porosity in the aquifer. That's basically the fraction of the aquifer volume that actively takes place in transport. The flow is calculated by the C2-VSIM or CVHM based NPSAT modeling. The porosity then basically, as Georgos already mentioned, gives you how much space there is for water to move through the pore system. So in another way to sort of look at how porosity impacts transport is the flow model. The NPSAT flow model will tell you, if you think about traffic over a large bridge, and for me, being from Davis, that would be the YOLO bypass between Sacramento and Davis. It has 6 lanes of traffic. 3 lanes on each side. And PSAT determines on a daily basis there is X 100,000 cars going over that bridge. What the porosity does, what you basically do here is, I'm going to give these cars 3 lanes or 4 lanes or 5 lanes or 6 lanes. If you give these 100,000 cars per day on that bridge 3 lanes, they're going to have to move much faster than if you give them 6 lanes. When they're 6 lanes, they basically end up moving slower because they have more space to move across if they all move sort of at an average rate. Similar to porosity, the smaller you make this porosity, the faster the travel time will be for the water to move through that pore space. That is exactly like it works for water content in the unsaturated zone. So you can select these values, both the water content and the porosity, or you can use default values that are shown when you click on this I button. Then under the load scenario, you choose this groundwater nitrogen loading model that I talked about earlier, and you basically choose between these 3 different dairy loading scenarios with the full manure application or the half manure application, or the scenario where we basically ignore that there is any manure in the system. So that's the load scenario. The well type scenario, you select between either looking at domestic wells or looking at public supply wells and irrigation wells. I want to just point out here, this is only with respect to what results you want to look at. This does not turn off, if you choose domestic wells, this does not turn off public supply wells or irrigation wells pumping. It just means that they're all pumping, but you're interested in just looking at the domestic well results, or you're interested in just looking at public supply wells and irrigation wells results. The reason why we split that up is these are both large number of wells. There's about 60,000, 55,000 domestic wells. There's about 25,000 public supply and irrigation wells in the system. The domestic wells tend to be on the shallower part, in the shallower part of the aquifer. The public supply wells and irrigation wells can be both in the shallow and the deep part and more distributed across the aquifer system. So looking at domestic wells, you're looking at younger water, typically more vulnerable water, and quicker development of nitrate. Then the unsaturated zone depth scenario refers to which unsaturated zone depth and travel time you want to choose. If you choose up here either one of these C2V simulations, then down here you want to use the C2V sim typical vadose zone thickness. If you choose a CVHM2 scenario, either pump adjusted or recharge adjusted, you want to choose the CVHM2 typical vadose zone thickness down on this input screen. I already talked about unsaturated zone effective water content. This is the unsaturated zone. So this affects the travel time through the unsaturated zone. Porosity affects the travel time through the aquifer. And again, for both, we have default values that go back to the calibration that we have done here against H tracers. And the default values reflect essentially these numbers that are circled. Then the simulation ending year is basically where you can specify how long you want to simulate, how far into the future you want to go. The year 2400, so about 400 years from now, not quite 400 years from now, that's about as far out as we can go. We don't allow you to go further out, and that's probably as far as you need to go. Things will, since nothing will change after your transition period, which is going to be sometime in the next 15 years when your new scenario will take effect, most things balance out after about 200 years. We've built sort of this extra years in just to so you can see some of the trailing ends of some of the breakthrough curves. Then you have this transition period. So in order to explain the transition period, I need to explain again what you're doing here. You're looking at we're looking at this source loading. And we're looking at this source loading over many years, right? We very early on, I talked about the fact that we have land use history going back to 1945. And that land use history from 1945 to 2020, that's fixed. You cannot change that. But what you can change is what happens in the future. And what we do on this transition in this transmission period screen is you basically say that when from over what period are we transitioning from what's happening right now, sort of the 2020 representative period, decade, 2020's decade, to where you want the new scenario to be. Because things don't change overnight, right? So you can give it a 10-year or 5-year transition scenario. And as you can see, your starting year is going to have to be in the 2020s. And then depending on when you pick your starting year, you can then pick your ending year to be 5 or 10 or maybe 15 years later. So that goes into this input screen. And so when you filled all of this out, so I've picked here C2V-SIM with pump adjusted to match the recharge. So I actually have less pumping than CVHM or C2V-SIM would have said, but I have exactly the amount of recharge that was in C2V-SIM in this case. I'm picking the default values for porosity and water content. I'm doing the full loading scenario with the full manure. I'm looking at domestic wells. The irrigation wells are pumping and the public supply wells are pumping, but the results are going to be focused on the domestic wells. I have the C2V-SIM beta zone thickness matching with the flow scenario, running through 2400, and my transition period is going to be from 2026 to 2036. So this is how this first screen looks like when it's completely filled out. First time, this is going to be very kind of take some time, and by the time you've done this 10 times, you can go through this really quick. And you click on next, and there comes the next screen. So the next screen looks like this. This is where you select your area of interest. On this screen, there's a number of different things. The first thing you will see is there is 6 tabs at the top. We have basically 6 different types of area of interest that you can select. On this map, you can zoom in and out on this map. You can change the map. You can have aerial photo behind it, or you can have this map behind it. What is blue is not selected. What is selected will be in red. So if I'm going to click on this with the mouse, then in this case, when I'm on this Central Valley tab, the entire Central Valley is selected. And if you do that, there is 58,461 domestic wells in there. So this number that's showing below the screen will be updated. You can also click on the Basin tab. In that case, you can either select the Sacramento Valley or the San Joaquin Valley, as I have here, or the Tulare Lake Basin by just clicking on that map. You can also pick 2. You can pick the Tulare Lake Basin, the Sacramento Valley, or the San Joaquin Valley and the Tulare Lake Basin. And by just clicking on this, you can basically turn your selection on and off. So that's how this works. And then the county map looks like this. So these are the counties across the Central Valley. You will basically select by county boundaries. You have the option to select by Bulletin 118 groundwater basin. So these are the DWR groundwater basins in the Central Valley, and you can select any one of them or any combination of them. You can go to the subregions tab. These are the 21 subregions that were called farms in the original CVHM model. These are the water accounting regions that we use to transfer C2V-SIM or CVHM recharge and pumping to the finer scale one. And we also leave them here for you to select these as some people use these regions. They are slightly different from the Bulletin 118. Some of them are the same, but many are different from the Bulletin 118 basin. There's more Bulletin 118 basins in the Central Valley than there are subregions. Finally, you can click on the Township tab and zoom in on the map and then select specific townships. Townships are mapping units, surveyor units that are about 6 miles by 6 miles. And you all know these townships from the major roads in most of our cities. They're basically lining up with the township boundaries. And then within that township, you have 6 by 6 sections, square mile sections. And that's where most of our cities have their major roads. So that's what these townships are. And you can select any one of them or any combination of those. And at the bottom of the screen, you will always see, for those that are highlighted in red here, you will always see how many wells that red highlighted area actually includes. Since we selected domestic wells, this would be representative of the domestic wells in this case. So depending on what you chose, this number will change. You can also select the sort of the wells in here that you're looking at for your results by their well depth and by the unsaturated zone thickness that you want to sort of prioritize. So when you click the advanced filter on, you get these sliders for the depth range of the well, and this refers to the total depth of the well below the land surface. So you can select a specific range here, and you can also select wells where they are have an unsaturated zone thickness that's within a specific range. The entire range that's indicated here would be representative of the region that you have here, and you can sort of make a sub-selection from that set of wells to ask some questions about, okay, I'm looking at, for example, I want to look at wells just with a really shallow unsaturated zone and see whether they are going to be more impacted than wells that are in an area with a deeper unsaturated zone. You can ask questions like this with this advanced filtering tool. Next, so here I've sort of set this up to be only a specific range. And then you can edit this by either moving these here back and forth, or you can actually enter the numbers here manually. Or when you enter the numbers, you can use these up and down arrows to change them. So there's a number of different editing options. And if you've done much on the internet, you'll probably be familiar with these tools. They should be fairly intuitive. Once you've done that, you click on Next. So that's all that's there to this particular second input screen. You click on Next, and you end up on this screen. So this is the Select Crops screen. This is your future scenario design template. So when you click, when you're on this screen, you see that there is crops listed up here. By default, all other crops are listed. All other crops refers to everything that you have not selected. And everything that you have not selected can be adjusted in terms of its future loading. 100% means the loading that is currently occurring at any one of the crops inside of this very large category in 2020. So 100% refers to essentially current loading as estimated by the groundwater nitrogen loading model. And this group encompasses this many million acres in the Central Valley. It's 13 million acres because it's a lot of the natural landscape as well that's included here. By clicking on this bar up here, so I've set it here to 80% for all other crops. Now, if I click on this bar, then there's this pop-up menu that comes up with this list of about 50 different crops. And we are considering to also include in this list the urban areas, the corrals, lagoons, et cetera, and let you play with those as well for what-if scenarios. Not necessarily that we think you can, there's much that can be done there, but for what-if scenarios. you basically can click on any of these crops and they will start populating this list up here. And they will also start populating the table below. And then as you populate this table, you can make adjustments on each of those. So I have, in this case, I've set all other crops to 95% of current loadings. And I'm going to look at what happens if the nut crops, almonds, pistachios, and walnuts, are doing a little bit more aggressive nutrient management and are actually getting to about 85% leaching from where they currently are. So this is a reduction of 15%. And that would be in the future, this reduction would happen over the time period that I have selected here. So sometime between sort of gradually between 2026, 2025 is still as 2020, but between 2026 and 2036, I'm gradually transitioning to go from 100% to 85%. And after 2036, forever, the loading will be at 85%. So that's really all there is to this particular screen. And this is where you really design your future loading. So once you've done that, you click again on next, and then you get this last screen. And on this screen, this is just for your own documentation. This is where you give your scenario a name. I kind of have developed my abbreviation C2 for C2V sim, P for pump adjusted, F for full, D for domestic, default for porosity, and default for water content. That way I can very quickly recognize what I've done here. And then here I write how much reduction I have. This is just for my own documentation. So when I go back to the home screen and I see all the scenarios, I can look all this up. So this is for your documentation. This will be saved together with the results. So when you look it up later, you know what you did here. Then having done that, you click on next. And as you can see, these are the 4 input screens. You're done. When you click on next after this, ta-da, your scenario goes into the queue at the server. At this point, this is out of your hands. All your input data gets transferred to the server, which is sitting on the UC Davis campus, and you're getting into the queue. And it'll sit there in the queue until all the other jobs are done. And at some point, this will switch to running. Now it's your turn. And once it's your turn, it will typically run, depending on how many users and how we divide this up among the nodes we have, a few seconds to maybe a few minutes. You can turn your computer off. You can go to do another task. You can close the tab. You can close the browser. Nothing will be lost. Once you're in this, once you're in the queue or running, this is just reflecting that it's doing something somewhere else. If you're waiting, at some point you come up with this screen and it'll say your simulation is complete. And you can say, oh, this was actually not the one I want to do. I want to create another scenario, or most likely we'll want to see the results. So let's go and look at these results. If you didn't wait, you closed your laptop or you closed your computer, or you closed the tab on the window, or you closed your browser altogether, and you're coming back at some point later, you end up coming back to the home screen, and your scenario, the last one you ran, will show up at the top of this table on the home screen. You just click anywhere on this space and it'll come back to the details and results. So either from here or from here, you end up with this screen, which are the details and results from your simulation. On that details and results screen, the first part here at the very top shows basically what you actually did. So your scenario name and your scenario description is here. And then everything you put in, how long you simulated, which flow scenario, which unsaturated zone scenario, et cetera, it's all repeated here. These are actually all the input data you provided. When you scroll down, the next graph that you see by default is a graph that shows the entire simulation period, in my case from 1945 until the year 2400 on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the nitrate as nitrogen concentration in milligrams per liter. And what it is showing here is for the, let's see, I had in my area of interest, which was the entire Central Valley, I had 57,340 wells. Those are the ones that have this depth range and this screen length range. And I might not have chosen unsaturated zone length, depth range. For these 57,000 wells, this is the the concentration that's not exceeded by 5% of wells. This is the concentration that's not exceeded by 50% of wells. So that's the median concentration across these 57,000 wells. This here is the 95th percentile. That means this is the concentration that's not exceeded by 95% of wells. So 95% of wells are going to be below this line. 5% of wells might be above this line. So you can see there's been significant increases since 1945, with loading being steady after 2020 and then being reduced after 2026. You can see there is some changes here, and then it kind of starts to quickly level off. Well, quickly is an exaggeration, right? We're talking about another 100 years for this high percentile. There's actually a decrease that comes in the median as a result of that load reduction. And at the 5th percentile, the concentrations always remain very, very low. So that's this screen. And what you can do in this screen is you can X these percentiles out, and you can select any other percentiles you want to see. And you can select one or many. You can also, you have these default tabs here that you can click so you get them quickly. I've clicked on this button, select all. We're showing you everything from the 1th percentile to the 99th percentile in some increments. And so you have the entire distribution of concentration here for each of these years on that time axis. Maybe one other way to look at this is if I'm looking at the year 2074, right? And I'm going to use my annotation tool here. Let's see what I can do this. Let me go back. Annotation tool, and I'm going to draw a straight line. So if I'm looking at the year 2096 right here, right? And so that's this year 2096. In this year, 5%, 1% of wells are going to be way low. Let's see, the dark orange line is the median. So that's this line here. So the median is at this low concentration, which corresponds to maybe less than 10. I lost the focus here because I'm showing all of these. If you're actually in the toolbox and you hover over this, you will actually see the numbers. I don't know that I captured that screen. I can show you maybe later in the Q&A session, in a live session. It will show you the concentration. And if you take these concentrations, you can basically construct a histogram of nitrate distribution across your, in this case, 57,000 wells in this year, 2096. So that's one way to interpret this graph. You also have the option to show this all as a box plot. So these boxes for each of these years will show the 5th percentile is the bottom whisker, the 95th percentile is the top of the whisker, the 25th percentile is the bottom of the box, the 75th percentile is the top of the box, and the median is the line inside the box. So just to repeat, 25% of the wells are going to be below the bottom of this box. 75% of wells are going to be below the concentration that's represented by the top of this box. 50% of the wells are going to be below this median concentration. When you scroll further down below this graphics where you have the line chart or the box plot of your results, you have the option to compare in this next graph below it. You compare your scenario, which is the blue one, that's your custom scenario, with what we call the base or business as usual scenario. So that business as usual scenario is the 2020 loading conditions carried forward on and on until the year 2400. And what this graph very nicely shows you for the percentile that you pick, so in this case, the 50th percentile or the median concentration under that load reduction that I specified is going to, over the next 25 to 50 years, next 50 years, the median concentration is going to go about 1 milligram per liter lower from what it would have been if I didn't do those reductions. So you have a measure of how much load reduction you can achieve, how much nitrate improvement in the wells you achieve, and when you achieve that, given the load reduction that's occurring in this period between 26 and 36, and then being carried forward at that new level after 2036. You can either do this as a comparison plot separately for each percentile, or if you want to see all of it all at once, there's this heat map, and when you move your cursor over the heat map, then you can actually see the actual concentration difference for, this is the 96th percentile in the period from 2020-95 to year 2030-20. So at the 95th percentile, we achieve a 3.47 milligram per liter reduction in nitrate. And if you scroll further down, the last screen on the results section is showing you what your reductions were that you had selected, just as a reminder. And it also shows you the crop area that's associated with each of these reductions, both in acres and in hectares. So that's the results. Now, a little bit further down is, under these results, is also a map. And on this map, it's showing all of these 57,000 wells. Now, these dots here are so large that you really can't see the individual wells. And so I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. What I can do here just really quickly is I can show these wells. I can color these wells either by depth of the well, by the thickness of the unsaturated zone above the well, by the distance between the water table and the top of the screen, or by screen length. And I can also filter these by a minimum age threshold. I can look at wells that have at least a certain age to see how many of these wells are older versus the whole group. So, for example, if I zoom in here to the southern part of the Central Valley and I select depth as the color on these wells, and I take a threshold of 500 years, there's very few wells that have water that's at least 500 years old and not younger. And you can see that by the color of these, all of these are on the green side, meaning they're all very deep wells that have at least 1,000 feet depth, and there's very few of them that have this kind of very old water. So this is sort of a very simple tool to learn something about the age and depth and construction details of wells. And depending on what you select here, you can also get a histogram for these, in this case, 57,000 domestic wells, and see the depth distribution across these wells. This is a box plot for these 4 different parameters, a box plot of the depth distribution, a box plot of the unsaturated zone depth, the water table depth, and the screen length. This would be across the entire Central Valley, the 57,000 domestic wells. And if you scroll further down, there are 2 links, one to our Well Explorer webpage and one to the unsaturated zone travel time webpage. If you click on the Well Explorer webpage, that is now a tool that looks similar to the previous screen, but it has nothing to do with the scenario that you ran. But on this toolbox, you can configure this to see more about wells, and specifically about the location of the source area of wells and the age of wells. Now, the source area of wells and the age of wells depends on whether you picked C2VSIM or CVHM and whether you picked pump adjusted or recharge adjusted flow scenario. So it depends on the flow scenario, and it depends on whether you want to look at domestic wells or irrigation wells. And you can focus this look at wells to your area of interest. So you get up here, you have the choices to look at your particular model, C2VSIM or CVHM, pump adjusted or recharge adjusted, domestic or irrigation wells. You select those, you select your area of interest, and again, you have these tabs here where you can select your area of interest. When you selected all of this, you click on Fetch Wells, and it will show you all of these wells. So basically repeated sort of the selections I had in my scenario, and I'm showing all these wells. I have to set the porosity here manually, so it's not carried over from the scenario to get to the travel time. And you can either use the slider or you can enter that on the right-hand side. You can zoom in, then you see your individual wells. And in this case, I'm actually going to look at just 2 townships. And then I can click on a well, and it will show me in yellow dots where the source area is for this particular well. There's another domestic well, has a source area fairly nearby, less than a mile away. These are all the source area points. I can, so this is the well, this is the source area. And so this well is getting all of its water from there. You can make these yellow dots sticky if you want, so you can look at multiple wells and see sort of get a sort of a pattern of these source areas in your area. And below the screen, you get a number of graphics that show the age distribution in that well from the top of the screen at 24-meter depths, which is about 75 feet, to 31-meter depth, which is about 90 feet. So from along that screen, it shows you what the depth is of these, in the case of domestic wells, 30 streamlines that connect the source area to the well. For production wells, it's 100 streamlines. For domestic wells, it's 30 streamlines. This is showing you the percent of these streamlines that are younger than the age here. So there's nothing younger than 20 years, but all of it is younger than 28 years. So your age range in this well is from 20 to 28 years. And this here shows the unit response functions from these 30 streamlines, basically showing you how long it takes for water on each of these streamlines without really mapping them to this, but just to give you an impression of, there's streamlines where it's a little bit faster, and there's streamlines where it's a little bit slower. And this is sort of the response. Very little for many, many years, then it kind of gradually increases. In the ones that are closest by, it peaks already after 14, 15 years. In some that are further away, it peaks after 26 years, and then gradually goes back to near zero after about 40 to 60 years. So all of this is to illustrate some of the the H mixing that goes on in the well. You can also in the, let's see, you can also go to the unsaturated zone toolbox, either here or on the previous scenario screen, and it'll show you the travel time. Let's see, you can look at travel time, Vadose zone depth, or recharge here. And you can pick your water content, since this is in the unsaturated zone. And then by putting the slider back and forth, you can actually compare what it is with CVHM, and you select whether it's pump adjusted or recharge adjusted, and what it looks like with CVHM versus what it looks like with C2V-SIM, and you can zoom in and out as you want. Finally, you also have the option to compare scenarios. So when you go to the home screen, on the home screen, when you've done a number of scenarios, you get your list of scenarios. And I'm going to go jump ahead a little bit. On that home screen, you have the option at the lower right to see 10, 20, or 50 per page of your scenarios. And you have the option to just look at certain types of scenarios from the many that you may have done. And then when you go there and you click the checkbox here and select multiple scenarios using this checkbox, you can compare up to 32 scenarios. So you click your checkboxes, and I have 6 or 8 different scenarios that are selected here, all in the Tulare Lake Basin, all done with CVHM2. And I want to compare the outcomes from those. This could include a BOW scenario, business as usual scenario, if you want to include that. I click on compare scenarios. And again, at the top of that screen, then you get sort of a repetition of what's selected. And then you can compare the breakthrough curves for these different percentiles from these different scenarios. To look at, how is CVHM different from, in this case, I did some scenarios with CVHM. I did some that were based on CVHM data, some scenarios that were based on C2V-SIM data, all of them for domestic wells. And I tried a half and a full and half and a full scenario for the manure, and I'm looking and a no manure scenario, and I'm looking at all these differences. So you can do line charts, you can do box plots, and that gives you a way to compare these. On all these scenario results, you also have the option to download your data, and you can zoom in to the time axis, and we might be expanding some of these zooming tools here, but you have options to zoom into your graph. You have also options to download these data and do your own graphs with it. And that wraps this up, what I wanted to say about this toolbox. I don't need to go back through the disclaimers on this tool. I think Yorgos did an excellent job pointing out some of the things you shouldn't be doing with this, or that this tool isn't meant to do. You can do it, of course, but the results may be questionable or make not sense in the way you would like them to be. So be aware of these things, and all of this will be, we'll post this presentation and the video of this presentation online, together with the link to this toolbox when it's open. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I can reshare, but I'm going to ask Dory to facilitate our question and answer session. Maybe, Dory, we can first go through some of the questions that are in the chat, if there are any. And otherwise, once we're through those, we can also do it with microphone and camera.
I don't have anything new right now. We'll give it a minute and give people a chance to type a question.
Yeah, feel free to use the chat box or just raise your hand, and I'll call you up, or Dory can call you up, and you can use your mic, unmute yourself, and also if you want, you can put your camera on and come on camera.
Yeah.
I know this was a very fast-paced walk through this tool, and I'm sure nothing stuck, so you'll have the slides to go back to when you're actually playing with the tool.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The unit response, how is that found? Like, is it calculated?
Yeah,
I
that's
feel
a
like,
great question.
okay.
I'm going to share my screen again. And Yorgos, do you want to answer that? I'm going to go back to. So the unit response function, just to kind of put this into context, that's so you have 30 dots here. These 30 dots are where the streamlines are starting at the water table below the source area, and then they wiggle around the aquifer, and all of them eventually go into this particular well. And this here is basically telling us if I had a loading of 1 milligram per liter of nitrate for 1 year, only for 1 year, at time 0, what would the breakthrough curve on that particular streamline, when it gets to the well? So this is the well, and if I pick the last one here, be the slowest one, the breakthrough curve, this would be the breakthrough curve on that one. And the way that that is found, Georgos can explain best on, and I can't jump around because I only have one screen, so I'm gonna have to just scroll through here. I want to go to this. So the yellow dots are here. This is where the yellow dots are. The red dot is right there where this well is, right? That's where the red dot was on that map. And you're asking, how is this unit response function? It looks like has sort of this shape calculated.
Yeah.
Georgos.
Yes. Yeah. Well, essentially, this is the results of a numerical model, a transport numerical model, where is solving essentially the advection dispersion uh, along its pathway, assuming, as Thomas said, a unit input loading for 1 year. And this is just a result straight of a numerical model that we develop, and we solve for each one individually, for each one path line, for each of those 4 million path lines that included in each model. We repeat this simulation 4 million times, essentially, to get 4 million unit response functions.
And then these functions are stored not by storing the entire line here, but actually it turns out they all have a near log normal distribution. And so that's actually a mathematical formula, and it has 2 parameters, the mean and the standard deviation. And so those are actually the only 2 numbers that are stored. So these 4 million streamlines end up being 8 million numbers that are in a database, and that is then being called up and recomputed when the convolution is done. Does that make sense, Story?
Yeah, so just based on the model. I didn't.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, on these streamlines, you have variable velocities. Sometimes it's a little bit faster, sometimes it's a little bit slower. And actually the streamlines will then sort of, sometimes when it's slower, it bulges up. When it's faster, it thins out. And that velocity comes from doing the flow simulation. Before you even get to the streamlines. So first there's the flow calculation that calculates the flow field in this aquifer system. Then there is the streamline calculation in that flow field to define each of these streamlines. And then there is the calculation of the transport in solving the standard advection dispersion equation along the streamlines to get the breakthrough curve at the well, which are these red curves, one for each of these streamlines.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here. Some, compliments, of course. because this has
Thank
been
you.
a very, very
Been
good presentation.
very intensive, and I appreciate
Yes,
everybody being patient to listen to the monologuing.
One question is, do the Bulletin 118 boundaries correspond to the nitrate management zones, or are they the more current 118
That
boundaries?
is a great question. So this is really with respect to choosing your area of interest, right? We currently do not have the nitrogen management zones in here. I do actually not know the degree to which the nitrogen management zones correspond to either these Bulletin 118 basins or the subregions, but we could consider adding the nitrogen management zones at some point as a extra tab at the top. I don't think we have nitrogen management zones yet through the entire Central Valley, but I don't know. But that's something we could definitely do. That wouldn't be too difficult to implement and have an extra tab up here that has the nitrogen management zones to the degree that they're already there. And then you can select one or several of those. We can do that. That would be actually, I'll take that as a suggestion.
Yeah. Is it possible to simulate nitrate load from the tile drains within a basin?
Great question. Yorgos, do you know so there's tile drains mostly on the west side, and they would be in both C2V-SIM and CVHM, and to the degree that they are defining a boundary condition in the flow, for the flow model, they would be carried over directly into NPSAT. Is that correct, Yorgos?
Yeah. Currently, I think the tile drains contribute to the recharge but I think it could be possible actually to include in the new versions of CV-NPSAT actually to include tile drains and have actually streamlines starting from those tile drains. If
that was needed.
It's needed, it's definitely possible and doable.
But they are what you're saying is they are in fact accounted for to the degree they are accounted for in CVHM and C2V-SIM as sources of recharge to groundwater. And as such, they would, streamlines that go from these tile drains to the wells would show up as well. They would be coming from these tile drains in the model. Right now, we don't have a way to track them specifically to tile drains. They would be just be tracked back to that source area where there are tile drains.
We want to discuss your future plans to do this for TDS or any other constituents.
Say that last part again, Dory. I didn't catch that.
Are there plans to bring in other constituents like TDS?
Yeah. And Yorgos, you can answer that.
Oh, you're muted, hon.
Sorry, I didn't hear the question because I was distracted by my kid.
The question is whether we are planning to expand this beyond nitrate. And you already talked about one big expansion that we're doing on this.
Yes. Right now, we can actually, if we develop salinity maps in the same way that we do with nitrate, we can actually do it very easily using this the tool that we have actually and include salinity actually loading. The problem is that salinity has this feedback mechanism which need to take into account. So it's not going to work like that. So we need to do, and that's why we developed this special case. And well, I mean, this is something that is already, we have already developed this model. It's being used under certain, but it uses very specific data, like it has to use a certain SWOT simulation results to actually it's combined with a specific version of CV-SWAT. So if we want to generalize this, we need to actually to think about it in a more general way than we are actually right now are implementing. Yeah, I don't see any reason why not. We cannot do that. The only problem is that it's going to take a little bit more time, I think, to do the salt simulation.
So as Georgos mentioned, there's the web application and then there's the toolbox behind it. And the Mantis salt is Georgos developed together with the technical team for the P&O study in the CV salts program. But that's not a web application. And at the moment, we hadn't really considered developing a web app front end for that particular application. But that could be something, if there's demand for that, that could be something to consider. The issue I see is that there's going to there are less options and probably fewer loading scenarios to play with on the salt side than there is on the nitrate side. With nitrate, given the many different crops and the many different management practices that could be enumerated in terms of their loading. So, but it is, as Georgos said, something we could consider. Given the demand for that.
Mm-hmm. Another question. My agency did a tracer study for our basin. Our engineering consultant is saying that there is enough data to calibrate the model. Our compliance regulators are saying they don't think so. Who gets to decide? And are there any guidelines in this regard?
Oh, that's a tough question. You got a bunch of experts saying different things.
Yeah.
And I'm not expert enough to say either one of them is right or wrong. So this is where I think modeling is also an art. There are guidelines, but they're not fixed guidelines. I would not be able to say, and I would not want to wade into that situation and say one or the other is right. You can always construct a model. The art is how detailed how the detail to which you build the model needs to reflect the detail that's available with respect to the data that feeds the model. So, and then the questions you can answer with a model will depend on how detailed the model is. You can answer some questions with a coarse model. You cannot answer other questions with a coarse model. When you go to a very fine model, and I'm not necessarily saying finely discretized, but something that just represents more detailed processes, more of the complexity of this source pathway receptor framework, you need more data. You need more data describing the sources in more detail in terms of flow and concentration and what drives that. You need to describe the pathways in more detail with respect to flow and concentration and reactions, and the same in terms of where the receptors are, how much they pump and how much they've pumped in the past. And in any application, there is a balancing between what's the question I have, what are the data that I have to feed my model, and how do I translate that into a conceptual model and then into a computer model or a spreadsheet model to get answers for my questions. And there has to be a balancing across all of these, and looking at that continuum between these questions, the questions asked, the data available, the conceptual model and implementation of that conceptual model. That's where the art lies and where it gets very difficult because there's so many different ways to do this. It's not possible to be very prescriptive in terms of guidelines. That's where the training and the expertise comes in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kira says, let's get cracking on an arsenic model. Likely impossible at this scale. Well done, harder team. See you all soon.
Thank you, Kira.
Okay, that's all of the questions that we have at this moment.
All right. Do we have anybody who wants to jump in on the microphone with questions? All right. Well, I can, yeah, then we can just leave it at that. I think we'll.
Oh,
Thomas?
we have somebody.
JP, welcome.
I don't know if I'm allowed to jump in.
You are
I didn't want to break
entirely
any protocol.
excited to see you.
I just wanted to, there's a, so the Bulletin 118 boundaries were used to set up the management zones. So they are Bulletin 118 boundaries,
The
but
nitrogen, the NMZ, the nitrogen, the nitrate management zones.
yeah, that's right.
Okay.
That's right. But they used the older version of the boundaries. So,
Okay.
and they can't change it because it's in it's in the basin plan now.
Yeah.
With the older lines.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really make any big difference about us being able to implement it. But there's a couple uh, of of basins where the line moved a little bit, and so the nitrate management zone doesn't line up perfectly. So I'm wondering if it wouldn't be a fairly minor
It would
piece
be
of
a
work
minor,
to just
it would be a minor piece of work
to
to
just
add that
have
tab.
the two
Yeah.
you could just say what
Yeah.
year version of the so I just want to I don't think it has to be a major project. I just think there for those ones that did move the line, that would I think that would be helpful to management zones to be
Okay.
able to look at what's actually happening in their actual
Yeah.
borders. So
We'll look
anyway,
into that. Yeah. Thank you, JP.
Well, you discussed having the tool up next week sometime, and that you also had that share feedback link for anybody that
Yeah,
wanted to.
so that's there. Maybe what I can do quickly is let me go back to sharing my screen and actually show this to you in the live version of this.
And we will also be publishing the recording of this on the GAMA homepage, and then it's available through you, I'm sure, if someone were to contact you. And
so let me get my floating panels away. So on the upper, this is the home screen after I log in, and the share feedback button up here gets you to a screen that looks like this. And that will come to Georgos and me and Shreya, who is doing the front-end development to review. So I'll just maybe quickly show you how this looks like when you're actually doing it. So I'm going to create a scenario. I'm going to pick C2V-Sim with pumping adjusted to match recharge. I use the default value for porosity. I used a full GNLM loading scenario. I'm going to look at just the public supply wells and the irrigation wells this time. And I'm going to pick, since I've picked C2V-Sim up here, I'm going to pick C2V-Sim for the Vedos zone thickness. And I use the default values for the Vedos zone water content. I'm going to run my simulation to the year 2200. I could select it from here, or I can just use the cursor and type it in here. So I do 2200 here. And then I pick my start year to be 2026 to 2036. So that's going to be my future loading. It's going to transition in that period to the future loading. There's explanations down here. I click on next. I wanted to select maybe a few bulletin 18 basins, maybe in this part of the valley. I can also zoom in here. I can select, I made the mouse so big now I can't navigate around here anymore. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted. Where did I end up? I jumped to another screen.
there you go.
Oops, no, that was the wrong one. Let's go back. Now I have to do this all over again.
That's okay.
That goes really quick. Yeah, I'm not used to having such a big mouse to work with. Enter to here, click on next, bulletin 118. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, use all these, and then, yeah, there. I can do, there we go. So I can do also satellite view. So then I can see more precisely what I'm looking at with that. That's especially useful when you look at townships. I'm going to click on next. And let's do a really simple one where I'm going to go. And so if I go up here, I get this drop-down list. And so I can pick, let's pick a couple big crops. Almonds are big. Citrus is pretty big. Cotton is still not to be neglected. Corn, grain. I'm going to pick I'm going to leave the nuts out. I want to do, since we did nuts earlier, I'm going to do potatoes. And they now all show up on this list. And, I can do reductions. Now, one of the things I should show here is, this is from a publication that Josue Medina Suara led over a decade ago, when we did the nitrate report for the state legislature, that showed the cost that's associated with achieving certain reductions in nitrate. And you can see that once you go above 15 to 25% reductions, there's going to be a significant cost associated with actually doing that. That's because there's an investment in technology, investment in training and capacity building, et cetera, that need to be achieved in order to get to this reduction. And so while it's really easy to just slide this thing, back and forth here, to really get to something realistic, you have to really consider the economics of that as well, if you really want to be realistic and not just hypothetical. I'm going to just slide these back and forth here just for the purpose of showing you how quickly this works. And then I click on next and type in my comments here and click on next, and it's going into the queue. And I had, I forget how many wells I had for this. I didn't look that up. And if Shreya did it right, this should go fairly quickly. I'm not sure whether maybe some other people are. No, it's running. So we're doing, the area that I had selected was most of sort of the central southern part of the San Joaquin Valley, and there it is done. So that's kind of showing how quickly this tool can work on this region that I selected here, right? And so this is the results screen here. Here's my line charts for the percentiles that shows the future, all the percentiles, or the box plot. Now, this is not informative by itself, but I can look at the comparison plot and I can sort of see how is it different now from what it would have been if I didn't make those changes. That's what this comparison plot is for. So that's how it looks like live, and that's how it works live. Gives us results sort of on the fly, and then I can download these results here, either as data, or I can download the graph, or I can snip it off the screen.
Shall we work together to send out an announcement when it's up next week?
Let's do that. Let's do that next week and get that out together to the registrant list.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dory. Thank you to State Water Board for the support. And thank you all for taking the time today for this webinar.
Yeah, no, this is exciting, and I'm excited for everybody else to play around with it. Yeah.
Looking forward to see what people think of it and what's getting done with it.
Yeah.
And then thank you to Georgos, Baibas, and Sendan for the presentation today.
Very much.
Great.
All
All right.
Thanks,
See you
guys.
all.
See you
Bye.
later.